Hello, everyone, and welcome to The Elephant in the Room, the new European University Institute Equity, Diversity and Inclusion podcast, where we explore how different factors such as gender and gender identity, sex, race, ethnicity, class, sexual orientation, religion or belief, disability, weight, and many, many others affect every part of our societies, from our places of work to politics, from culture to history, food, and everything in between. We will also reflect together with our guests on the intersectionality of these factors, both within the same under-recognized groups presenting these characteristics and in the wider society. This podcast makes us all part of the conversation because we are all part of the story. So I'll introduce a little bit myself. I'm Giuseppe Zago. I'm the Equity, Diversity and Inclusion Officer at the EY. And the theme of this first series of our podcast revolves around EDI days of celebration. You may have noticed that they have grown in number over the years, and we will use them as an opportunity to discuss how the EDI landscape is changing and how it's progressing. Diversity and inclusion are used as more and more as buzzwords in our societies and in our conversations, but they actually imply layered meanings and a patient activity of advocacy and incremental change that was made possible by multiple generations of activists, researchers, and professionals over decades. So we will talk about all this and what this all means for the EY right now and in the near future. Today, we will take inspiration from our first key date, the 3rd of December, which marks the International Day of Persons with Disabilities. To get us through the various issues concerning disability, I'm very excited to have here with us today Professor Monika Baar. Professor Baar joined the UI on the 1st September 2022 as Joint Chair in the history of East Central and Southeastern Europe, late 19th century to the present, at the Department of History and Robert Schuman Center. Before, she was professor at Leiden University. Professor Baar, Monika, specializes in the history of East Central and Southeastern Europe, with a research focus on the history of disabilities. As Joint Chair, one of her main aims is to work towards a more diverse and inclusive European history that pays attention to marginalized groups. At the same time, she hopes to raise awareness of the status and needs of vulnerable citizens in Europe and beyond. So hello, Monika, welcome, and we are very happy to have you here today to talk about disability inclusion and to help us launch in this new podcast series. I'd like to start first by asking you why history of disability. Why did you decide to specialize on this area in particular?
Well, let me start with saying that I'm really honored to be the inaugural contributor to this podcast series. And so I would like to thank for the opportunity and for the interest in my work. And let us hope that this initiative is going to become a stellar success. Now, why I decided to specialize in the field? This is not an ordinary story because it was a matter of serendipity rather than a conscious or a strategic choice. My doctoral and postdoctoral work was on something completely different, 19th century nationalist historiography in East Central Europe. So it had nothing to do with this topic. And 10 years ago, there was absolutely nothing that would have indicated that one day I would be sitting here with you to record a podcast on disability. But at around 2012, I took a flight, a late night flight, I remember very well, from Berlin to Budapest. And I was so tired that I couldn't do anything meaningful. I couldn't sleep. So I started to leaf through the in-flight magazine, which I hardly ever would do. And so there I found a short article on the International Day of Guide Dogs for the Blind. And it's funny that it was another international day. And that arose my interest in the history of blindness, in the history of disability, in the history of animals. And it was that article in the In-Flight magazine that inspired me to change my topic completely. So if I can use the cliche, I didn't find my topic found me.
So it really is serendipity indeed. Thank you for sharing this the story. It's not an unusual way to get into an academic topic like this one. I guess my next question is more about, well, the day in itself. So the International Day of People with Disabilities. Why are we having this day, and where this idea came from? Can you tell us a little bit more about it?
Okay, so here I have to contain myself because I led a research project on the implications of the International Year of Disabled Persons worldwide. And that's when all it started. So if I become too enthusiastic and I go on for too long, please, Giuseppe, remind me that it's time to move to the next question. So the International Year of Disabled Persons was held in 1981, and it was initiated by the United Nations. And so the UN organizes these international years, decades, and days dedicated to various issues such as human rights, environmental rights, linguistic rights. And the main idea is to raise awareness. The first ever year was the World Refugee Year. And then I'm sure that many of our listeners remember or at least know the International Year of Women, 1975, and the International Year of the Child, 1979. So the International Year of Disabled Persons, which was first suggested to be called International Year for Disabled Persons, and then it had to be changed because for and of have, of course, different implications. So it took place amid a great financial crisis. And this is also very interesting because the people who were actually addressed, disabled people, became very upset. They were not at all impressed by this year because they found that there was a lot of propaganda, a lot of lip service, but their needs were really not addressed. And they started to protest. And so this creative potential in the frustration then later triggered many fantastic changes. Now, how come I'm talking about the International Year of Disabled Persons, whereas you asked me about the International Day of Persons with Disabilities? Well, since this year in 1981 didn't accomplish too much, the decision was first to dedicate the next decade to disabled people. So that was the International Decade. And as the International Decade came to an end, and once again, people had to conclude that, well, we didn't achieve too much, the decision was made to dedicate the 3rd of December to this cause. To the best of my knowledge, unlike some other UN observances, there was no specific reason as to why we are observing this date on the 3rd of December. Other than that, there was still space in the UN calendar. And this is not always the case. And perhaps I can mention another international day because perhaps we can indicate that this is the 3rd of December is just an umbrella day. And the UN also has some other international days that are dedicated to more specific purposes and disabilities. And one of them is the World Down Day on the 21st of March. And here there's a very specific reason why we are observing World Down Day on the 21st of March, because it signifies the uniqueness of the duplication of the 21st chromosome, which causes Down syndrome.
Thank you, Monika. This is so interesting because I think it shows how perceptions around EDI issues more generally and disability more specifically have changed through time. So even, the first attempt to have this date and how it wasn't really well received by the same disability community. And I think we will discuss a little bit more on that later. But before going into this, since you have mentioned the UN, the United Nations, and since disabilities, but also more generally issues of equality, diversity, and inclusions are really related to the legal framework and what kind of legal protections we have as people and as citizens. I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about what kind of protections we have in terms of human rights or international human rights when it comes to people with disabilities.
Okay, so first of all, as a historian, I could start with pointing out that the disability is today considered as a matter of human rights, is the result of a long historical process. And even today, I think for many people, this is not self-evident. For a very long time, disability was perceived first and foremost as a medical issue, as an individual defect that had to be fixed. And it was an important breakthrough when in the 1970s, disability activists developed an alternative model to this medical model, the so-called social model. Now, what was revolutionary about the social model? According to this, disability is actually caused by society. It's not located in the individual. Just to illuminate what I have in mind, let us imagine that John, an imaginary John, is not able to climb up here to the Villa Salviati. Now, according to the medical model, this is because John's legs are paralyzed and he needs to use a wheelchair, and the Villa Salviati is not wheelchair accessible. But according to the social model, the reason why John cannot access the Villa Salviati is that there are no ramps, that the Villa Salviati is not accessible. This is a huge difference. However, soon it became obvious that every model, and even the social model, has its drawbacks, because in the social model, somehow the body has disappeared. How about pain? How about bodily sensations? So today, usually we combine these two models and we are talking about the so-called biosocial model, which acknowledges that disability has indeed some medical or health related causes, but then it has to be interpreted in the context of the reactions from society. Now, we haven't yet talked about human rights. So how did we jump to human rights? In the 1960s, 70s, and 80s, there was a lot of international engagement. And we are talking about disability if we are talking about disability in a global context, I should also note that disability was also interpreted as a matter of humanitarian intervention, as a matter of development. And so reaching the conclusion that all this combines into a framework that does have human rights issues and that is related to dignity, it was a very significant milestone. I have to cut a long story short here. In 2008, the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities was adopted or entered into force. And this is somehow, this is really revolutionary because it is a binding legislation. It's not some kind of optional thing. But just as every convention and every human rights regulation, it does have its disadvantages, or it needs to be improved in the future. So some criticism was leveled at the convention because questions arose whether it really recognizes the diversity of different needs across the world. And of course, even the human rights framework has to be contextualized within a broader framework. We shouldn't forget about issues of poverty, climate change, natural disasters, war and violence, unfortunately very topical today, and even the survival of colonial legacies.
So thank you. This is really interesting, and I think it shows us how the legal conceptualization of these concepts, but also the development of these models around disabilities are also very much affected on the way our perception of these issues change through time and through awareness. And so I was wondering if you think there is an influence of the media and how these issues are communicated, well, nowadays in social medias, in the past through other outlets, and how they influence and they shape the way society looks at disability and people with disabilities. So I don't know if you can tell us a little bit more about that.
Sure. So I think the social media offers a lot of opportunities to amplify the message that we would like to convey. But there are several issues. One of them is that the social media doesn't tolerate ordinary things. For an item to make it into the news, it really needs to be out of the ordinary in one way or another. So media doesn't help to convey a balanced conceptualization. I mean, a certain degree of sensationalism is almost always present. Just let me mention two ends of the spectrum. When we think of people with disabilities, and especially as represented in the media, we might think of the overcoming superhero, like the very special disabled person. Maybe think of the Paralympics and these champions who are being hailed for having overcome their adversities. But I have heard some participants of the Paralympics complaining about how their preparations for the Paralympics had wrecked their already vulnerable bodies. So there's also a certain aspect of commercialization here. But then at the other end of the scale, we have the representation of people with disabilities as tragic victims. And sometimes this is even happening with good intentions. In some countries where charities are expected to cater for the needs of people with disabilities, they need to obtain funding for this. And then they need to compete for donations on a very fierce donations market. So again, they are compelled to make disability look everything but ordinary.
Wow, that's so interesting. And I think it also applies to other under-recognized groups, right? It reminds me of the LGBTQ plus community, for example, and the whole debate around the medicalization of trans issues and how the LGBTQ people are represented in the media, often through tropes. And so it's so interesting to realize that there are also these type of biases in relation to people with disabilities. I'm wondering if you can say something about the way the disability community perceives these types of representation. So how they see themselves represented in the media, and especially how they see their disability also in connection with other parts of who they are that maybe are overlooked or not considered by the mainstream media.
Well, just to give you a few examples, I'm improvising here. Disability is a very heterogeneous category. And so very often when the concept of disability is represented in the media, then it is done through the image of a wheelchair user. Whereas we know very well that only a very small minority of disabled people use wheelchairs. On the other hand, we hardly ever see people who are deaf or hard of hearing being represented, because it's so difficult to convey that condition. And the same also applies with something similar, a similar pattern to people with mental disabilities.
All right. It's really interesting because I'm thinking also about the different types of disabilities within the same disability community. So are there different views, for instance, between people who have visible disabilities as compared to people who have invisible ones, or people with physical disabilities rather than mental disabilities?
Well, I'm very glad that you asked this question, Giuseppe, because this appears to be something of a taboo. What do I mean by the taboo? That the disability community may also have prejudices towards some of its own members. And indeed, there exists a certain internal hierarchy within the disability community. And this hierarchy actually mirrors the perceptions, or may I say prejudices, of the able-bodied world. Now, what do I have in mind? Many times I've heard from a proud disabled wheelchair user, I have nothing to do with those idiots. And of course, people who were referred to are people with mental health issues. And this is something, this is a phenomenon that is called horizontal hostility. And so, of course, this also raises questions about solidarity within a certain minority group. And as we already established several parallels between other minority groups, such as members of the LGBTQI community or migrants, I think here again, I would like to emphasize that this very heterogeneous nature of disability means that we come across very complicated situation and that it is very difficult to achieve this solidarity, because often the only thing what connects people who are labeled as disabled, the label itself. They can have so different lives, so different conditions.
So it's really interesting. So this difficulty in having to define certain characteristics or certain groups in order to support or to recognize them, but at the same time, these labels can also become a little bit some cages sometimes. Of all the examples you mentioned, I was thinking, and I'd like to focus a little bit more on mental health, because from my experience as EDI officer, but also as a person who went through COVID and as nephews and nieces, I know that mental health is still quite an overlooked issue and some sort of stigmatized form of illness or issue, let's say more generally. So I don't know if you share this view, if you think there is still some work to do when it comes to mental health, even now in 2023.
Indeed, I believe there's a lot to be done. And it is true that the COVID perhaps to some extent helped to destigmatize this condition, but only to a certain extent. And I think that one of the multiple problems with mental illness is that it is not always consistent. I think we often have problems with conditions that might be constantly changing, not only the ones that are invisible. And it's very difficult. It might be very difficult to understand why someone is in a state which makes it impossible to perform on week 1 and completely back to so-called normal week 2. So I think that if we understand that disability is a constantly changing category, this can help to improve in this context.
Thank you. That's a very powerful message, I think, and it's something we should keep in mind also in our work, I think, and when we talk with our colleagues or fellow researchers or with our families and friends. We are all people in flux, I guess, so thank you for this.
Well, in fact, if I might interrupt, so there is a concept that is used in disability studies, the so-called, so that we are all temporarily abled. What does it mean?
What do you mean?
It means that it is a very likely scenario that all of us, especially if we live long enough, are going to encounter disability at some point in our lives. All of us are only one accident away from disability. So this concept of being temporarily able, it flips the concept around, and it reminds us of our own vulnerability.
Right. Well, it's also very powerful, and it changes the perspective completely. Also, it makes you think that accessibility is really for everyone, because at some point everyone can have some form of disabilities or obstacles or barrier to face. I was also thinking about, before starting this post, so I'm gonna disclose something before starting this podcast. You were telling me about some events that you are organizing together with other colleagues here at the UI around mental health. I don't know if you want to say a little bit, can we say a little bit more about that, or is it too soon and we are spoiling?
I would be very happy to say something about this, all the more so because it indicates that disability is both an intellectual issue that is for research and the practical matter. And here at the UI, we are going to work on both aspects. So next year, that is in 2024, we are celebrating the centenary of an famous Italian psychiatrist, Franco Basaglia, who was a reformer and who proposed the dismantling of psychiatric hospitals. And Basaglia wrote most of his work on so-called democratic psychiatry in Italian, and therefore he's not very well known outside Italy. So our aim, and this is a small project of the History of Science and Medicine Working Group here at the UI, we are planning to organize an event which we run in parallel with other events organized in the city. For instance, in the former San Salvi Mental Hospital. And our aim is to show some films, to organize a roundtable, and also to show that an intellectual such as Franco Basaglia and his life work is not only relevant for mental health, strictly speaking, because we are also hoping to have a contributor who will be speaking about Basaglia's influence on feminism in Yugoslavia.
Wow, that's really interesting. I would like to ask you more about that, but maybe we don't have enough time, but maybe for another episode, feminism and Franco Basaglia. As an Italian person, I heard a lot about Franco Basaglia. He really changed the way we looked at mental health in our country. And this brings me also to a reflection around language that I would like to share with you. And it's something that that I really care deeply when it comes to inclusive language and how to talk and about EDI issues and how to address people that belong to under-recognized categories and groups. And so I was thinking around inclusive language. So I see that sometimes there are some difficulties from people, some hesitancy in approaching people with disabilities because they don't know if they are using the right words. So inclusive language can be a very powerful tool, but in some ways it can also become a barrier that prevents people who are afraid to speak, from approaching people with disabilities in this case. Do you have any thoughts on that? Did you see it as well?
Absolutely. And I think that we should do everything to take this fear away, because we don't need a language police. What we need is respectful use of language. And of course, we have to emphasize that using insulting words on purpose is absolutely unacceptable. But we also have to recognize that concepts and words keep changing all the time, precisely because disability is not a fixed category. And it differs also from language to language. Let me give you one example. I mean, Please. You might have heard that I am using disabled people and people with disabilities interchangeably.
Yes.
And you might be asking which is more correct, or is not one of them outdated? And I could say that the disabled as a category is indeed outdated, and we wouldn't recommend using it. And even though at the moment in the official, for instance, UN documentation, the usage is persons with disabilities, not everyone in the disability community accepts this, because it's also a matter of to what extent disability is part of your identity. Yes. And my former research project has a Twitter account, and it often happened that whenever we treated something using disabled people, we got some angry reactions. How do you dare to use this? You have to use people with disabilities. And when we tweeted using people with disabilities, we equally got angry reactions. How dare you use people with disabilities? So I think that all this shows not only the power of language, but also the fact that this condition is not fixed, it is in constant flux. And as long as we are respectful and we don't want to do damage on purpose, it is perfectly okay to make mistakes, because sometimes we are shooting on a moving target.
Right. So I use people with disabilities all the time in this podcast. So let's prepare for some feedback that may be a little bit controversial. No, I'm just kidding. But thank you. That's really interesting. And I was wondering, so what does a person should do if he makes a mistake or they make a mistake approaching a person with disabilities or a disabled person? Sorry.
What is a mistake is also a matter of definition. But yes, I think that it is perfectly okay to respectfully approach the person and maybe to indicate that, this terminology is now out of date, and also maybe indicating that the new one that we are currently using is likely to be out of date soon. It's also a very interesting issue because sometimes, these words and terminologies change quasi naturally, but sometimes there's conscious effort. Just to give you one example, we have been talking about Down Day. So obviously today, if someone used Mongolism, I would indeed correct this person because it was precisely with the aim to destigmatize the condition that the new terminology that is Down syndrome was adopted. But it is very likely that over time, Down syndrome will accumulate the kind of prejudices that it was used to take away, and we might have to come up with a different concept.
Okay, thank you. That's, again, we are always in flux and we are always learning, and that's perfectly fine until we are respectful. I'm thinking now, talking about learning, so let's think about our own institute. You mentioned before Villa Salviati, for example, and of course, I'd like to talk a little bit with you about disability inclusion at the institute. How do you see it? And if you have any recommendations on how we could improve as an institute? I'm thinking, of course, about our environments. I think our listeners who work or study or do research at the UI, they can imagine what kind of obstacles they have experienced, the obstacles we have. But I'm thinking also more in terms of how we should raise awareness on these issues, and if there is a need to raise awareness on these issues at the UI.
Absolutely. So I think whenever we think of the UI and accessibility, the first thing that comes to our mind is the built environment and the lack of accessibility, obviously. And I think that in this case, perhaps we need to combine perseverance or persistence with patience. And what do I mean by this? It is very easy to dismiss any attempt to improve accessibility with the excuse, well, these are monumental buildings. It is totally hopeless because the cost would be such that, that they cannot be afforded. So I think that we have to go against this excuse. On the other hand, and perhaps I'm not making myself very popular here, we also have to recognize, and here I'm talking about solidarity, that in order to improve accessibility overall at the UI and in the context of social justice, physical accessibility is one particular need, and there are many others. Therefore, the idea that now all the budget that we have should be kind of hijacked and to use for one particular purpose, in my view, is also not the way to go forward. So that's why I'm saying that persistence and patience combined.
Great. So thank you for sharing your impressions and your opinions on what we should do at the UI. And again, I think the concept of solidarity is something that we should really try to apply in all our lives, at the UI altogether. And I think it goes back again to the idea of disability as a biosocial model, right? So I think we're about to reach the conclusion of our first episode. So Monika, we're so grateful to have you here and for the time that you dedicated to us today. But before saying goodbye, we would like to ask you some recommendations. So do you have a book recommendation, a movie, or maybe other podcasts that our listeners could look at if they want to and learn more about what we have talked today? Also, your own books are fine,
Well, it's a rather daunting task to single out one particular item, but I would then like to recommend a novel which is very close to my heart. Mm-hmm. And funnily enough, I mentioned Iceland in a very different context, but here I'm recommending the book of an Icelandic writer whose name is Einar Már Guðmundsson, and I'm not even sure about the pronunciation. And the title is Angels of the Universe. And this book has been translated into many languages, and there's also a film. So hereby I'm recommending both a book and a film. And maybe a few words about why this book is so close to my heart. It is a piece of fiction, but with autobiographic elements. And it is dedicated to the author's brother, who suffered from schizophrenia. He was a very talented young artist and committed suicide. And so the book tells us a lot about mental illness, about the conditions in psychiatric establishments, and many other gloomy and tragic topics. But it is combined with a unique sense of humor. And the story is embedded into Icelandic history and culture in a unique way. And what is so special about the book is that the reader keeps asking all the time, okay, so what is pathological and what is normal? And who are the normal people? Are they the ones outside the psychiatric hospital or are they the ones inside? And so I have a particular reason for recommending the book and the movie. And this is because in March, we are going to discuss the book in the UI Film Club. And the film is planned to be screened in the UI Movie Club. So I'm hereby inviting everyone to come and join us. And perhaps the last motivation why I recommended this book and not some scientific product is that we academics usually think in terms of research monographs, articles, arguments, but this book is a very powerful reminder that art can be one of our most engaged ally in promoting inclusion and diversity here at the UI and also beyond.
Wow, thank you, Monika. We'll definitely register to the book club and the movie club now that I know about this. Thank you very much, everyone, for listening, and see you at the next episode of our podcast, The Elephant in the Room.
And thank you very much, all elephants in the room, for inviting me.
Thank you, Monika.